session to our series on musical worship led by Ben, and we're on to his penultimate session now, unbelievably, and taking us well into what many would consider to be a golden age of English choral music in the late 19th century, well, the opinions differ, but I look forward to hearing what he has to say to us this evening. And yeah, over to him now.
Thank you, Father, and thank you all for joining us for the 5th session, where we're going to start to see and hear things much more familiar to us. Can everyone see the slideshow? Raise your hand now if you can't. Just want to get that out the way early. Great. And just for info, before we kick off, I've put the links to the 2 works that I'm going to talk about in the session. They're PDFs if you want to have a look at them while we're talking. Whilst much in society can be said to have improved during the Age of Enlightenment, Anglican worship cannot be counted as amongst them. One could see why. In an age of philosophical and intellectual advance, where it could be argued that nothing stood still, the worship of the church would have been a low priority for development. But why? Worship was often seen as something to have been endured or got through rather than experienced. Like today, its study remains a niche sport. Development in liturgy had remained amateur practices, personal devotions and prayers, creative outpouring in poetry. Since the annexation of the 1662 prayer book to law through the Act of Uniformity, it had been seen both within the church and in politics as a third rail, not to be touched. If we look at our nonconformist or free church friends, however, this period was rich and fruitful. Within each of their groupings, hymnody and worship texts began to be explored. For Methodists, material from the Church of England was brought with them. Their paraliturgical preaching services, with emphasis on expository and evangelistic preaching, caught the CFE off guard. Gathering at first in small rooms, then fields and public places, these groups seized on an era where the established church deservedly had retreated. For we find in the 18th century and early 19th century a church merely going through the motions. Horton Davis refers to the Church of England as unmanageable by the 18th century, with large and unwieldy dioceses often set away from growing commercial centres. We note that church building during this period was exceptionally limited, save for the occasional proprietary chapel for the use of controversial or dissenting clergy. The era is typified by non-resident clergy, drawing multiple stipends for multiple roles, the art of plurality. The most famous literary example of this, of course, was prebendary Vasey Stanhope in Trollope's Barchester Towers. Stanhope had been in Italy for 12 years, recovering from a sore throat, whilst having enough energy to collect butterflies around Lake Como. But it's unclear whether Stanhope paid a perpetual curate to cover his living at Stoppingham during that period. The perpetual curate, of course, being a cleric given a portion of someone else's stipend to live off and do the basics of work whilst the rector or vicar was somewhere else. So it's no surprise that at the start of the 19th century, those in the Church of England who were looking for something that would enliven and deepen their faith. So some of you may be disappointed that we haven't delved into the evangelical revival of the 18th and 19th centuries, but it kind of falls outside the purview of this series, as its legacy really doesn't affect the worship and music of the Church of England until later in the next century. But one revival or movement that did have an enormous effect on both is, of course, the Oxford movement. The original Oxford movement attempted to reflect larger movements in European thought. Its concern for the historical continuity of the past with the present, its idealization of the principal authority in both church and state, which revolution somewhere across the English Channel had recently denounced, and latterly, its stress on organic growth and development. One of the interesting things to note about it is that it doesn't begin as an opposition to evangelical revival, but as a reaction against liberalism, as carried on in secular and infiltrating eventually religious life from the Enlightenment. What is clear is that by the time the Oxford movement had begun to take hold in the mid-19th century in England, equivalent movements in France and Germany had been in existence since early in the century. In fact, without the evangelical revival and its emphasis on personal religion, one could make an argument that the movement would have been severely weakened from the outset. Indeed, the early adherents of the Oxford movement, the Tractarians, named of course after their publication, Tracts for the Times, published between 1833 and 41, and the Evangelicals, shared an almost unified view on two areas of interest to us, the prayer book and hymnody. Whilst later Tractarians would move forward on a Romeward bent, the early adherents supported the view expressed by Alexander Knox that, "I know nothing settled in the whole Reformed body but the liturgy of the Church of England. To the liturgy, therefore, I adhere as the silver cord which unites us to the great mystical body." Hymnody, of course, was something that was heavily rooted in evangelicalism during this period. Hymnody was never going to be unifying. Evangelical hymnody of the period focuses on subjective, individualistic, and quite often introspective in tone, whilst Tractarian hymns were objective and corporate in emphasis. Evangelical hymnody, of course, often reflected the singular piety of the period, reflected in the melodies of Dr. Sankey or others, whilst Tractarian hymns fueled translation of Latin, Syriac, and Greek hymnody of the early or earlier church, with melodies written to reflect the meter, and through this period held burgeon and growing revival in plainchant. However, both sides recognized each other's merit, copying and borrowing as the plethora of hymn books published grew. The liturgy for the Tractarian was almost equated as important as scripture. In Tract 86, the Welsh priest Isaac Williams wrote, "In our Reformation, we differ from other Reformations, and as a church we differ, I think, from other churches as now existing, in retaining more purely and entirely the threefold cord which is not easily broken, scripture, tradition, and the sacraments." Williams continued, "For rituals and forms of prayer, however unimportant in human eyes, assume a very high character and value when considered as the appointed means of access from man to God, as methods of approach to him which we are bound to make use. For as individuals, we have no choice, as moreover objects of sacred association to which the affections of good men will naturally become attached from use. And the more attached, the better they are, as instruments, however mean in man's estimation, which serve as vehicles through which healing and virtue go forth from Christ to restore our soul's maladies, as molds of thought and expression to those suits which in the majestic words of Hooker, the Almighty doth there sit to hear, and angels intermingled as associates attend to further." This passage reveals the great understanding Tractarians had of the capacity of sacred ritual to mold both Christian thought and expression by a process of which the worshipper is almost unconscious, yet is power in the persistence and unity of its effect. Casting off the necessity for fad and passing fashion, by remaining faithful to what had been so, as to remain faithful as to what was and is to come, left a permanent effect on the church, one we have again seen return in this season of COVID. In no other place do we see this higher than in the Tractarian devotion to sacraments, and in particular the Eucharist. In Tract 81, Edward Pusey recalled that the task of the church throughout the ages is therefore to offer the memorials of the one sacrifice which Christ, our great high priest, unceasingly presents before the Father, the representation of which he has commanded us to make. Pusey and the Tractarians insisted on a doctrine of real presence in the sacrament, cleverly without probing detail of the mode of the manifestation of the presence, save that it was located upon the altar. Whilst this leaves a lot of questions unanswered and would then, as now, leave brows furrowed in some quarters, they were wary of explaining it in any way that could remove any residuum of mystery. Whilst the theological thought was owned by Oxford, it was another group in another place who began exploring the liturgical exuberance that we now associate with the Oxford movement. As J.H.R. Moorman noted, the leaders of the movement at the start were reasonably satisfied with the liturgical standards of the day. They were teaching a doctrine of the Eucharist and the real presence, which demanded a greater reverence for the altar and all that surrounds it. Both Keble and Newman preached in black gowns, a custom of the time, especially within the University of Oxford, later expanded by Percy Dimmer, and celebrated communion in surplice and hood at the north end of the altar. The seeds of ceremonial reform were advanced by John Mason Neale, whilst an undergraduate at Cambridge, through the founding of the Cambridge Society, later to be the Cambridge Camden Society. The endeavour of the Society, through lectures and publications, was not only antiquarian, but intensely practical. Let us endeavour to restore everywhere amongst us the daily prayers and, at the least, weekly communion, the proper Eucharistic vestments, lighted and vested altars, the ancient tones of prayer and praise, the meet celebration of fasts and festivals. The study of ceremonial was, as it remains now, a niche sport. At this stage, much was written whilst some exotic clergy tested the waters. For instance, Charles Seeger, Edmund Pusey's assistant, embroidered a very small cross in gold thread at the bottom of a plain stole. Evangelical rage was engaged, with a censure following from the Bishop of Oxford. Pusey himself advised in this period against restoring richer vestments, on the score that they were unsuited to the then present humiliated state of the Church of England. The architectural legacy, in its broadest sense, remains with us as a half-life. Almost no church was unaffected by the ideas espoused by the Cambridge Camden Society. The Society's commercialization of its academic ideas was spurred on by an increase in church building and restoration. From highest cathedral to lowliest parish, ideals as disparate as the installation of a pipe organ, the position of a robed choir in the chancel, indeed the robed choir was an innovation of the period, to what some might uncharitably describe as a 19th century form of ecclesial IKEA furniture store, ready-made designs ready for exporting to a church near you. What has always amused me about this is how the early Oxford movement leaders looked to the primitive church as an example, but opened the floodgates to tat both wonderful and awful at the same time. I touched earlier on the malady of pluralism. Regrettably, cathedrals were not immune from the prevailing neglect and dereliction. During this period, the deanery of Carlisle was combined with the rectory of St. George's, Hanover Square, the deanery in Carlisle only being used during summer months. In a 10-month period, the Dean of St. Paul's had not attended worship in his cathedral, and the residentiaries rarely attended more than 30 days a year. Precentors and minor canons were often appointed without skill, training, or interest, obtaining the office as a mere sinecure. The chapter of Bristol during this period appointed a precentor so hopeless that the cathedral abandoned the choral performance of part of its service. At St. Paul's, the number of choirmen were reduced to 6. At Westminster Abbey, most of the choral work was devolved by its singers to deputies. The reformer John Jebb noting that the choristers' surplices were more black than white, the books were torn and soiled, there was a squalid neglect in all the accessories of divine worship. If this was the state of affairs at Westminster Abbey, which was still at the centre of national and court life during this period, think of how much worse it was in other parts of the country. It was not uncommon to find choirs in provincial cathedrals with only one competent singer on the back row. This, of course, explains some of the works we discussed at the end of last week's session, including Morris Green's Thou Visitest the Earth. Samuel Sebastian Wesley's anthem, Blessed be the God and Father, too, is allegedly an example of this, although whether the lone bass was the Dean's Verger or Butler is lost to the glorious annals of history. Choir practices were nigh on unknown, the repertoire limited to a small corps repeated in rotation. Many organists themselves were not competent. Any with half a skill complained that their chapters did nothing to advance musicality or invest in the purchase of music. The ones who suffered most, however, were the choristers. It's clear that their lot was an unhappy one. Depending on the cathedral, choristers could be seen moonlighting as servants for clergy or, as was seen in several, loaned out for commercial work. Their musical education was near nil. Their general education often fared little better. The reformer, Maria Hackett, prominently campaigned for better conditions for choristers through this era, and strides were made in ensuring a decent level of musical and general education, as well as combating neglect and guaranteeing a general duty of care by those tasked with that responsibility. S.S. Wesley, writing in 1849, reflected on the poor state of affairs. No cathedral in this country possesses, at this day, a musical force competent to embody and give effect to the evident intentions of the Church with regard to music. Yet it didn't stop Wesley or his contemporaries composing. If we take his anthem, Blessed be the God and Father, as a case study, we see a chordal opening by the chorus that is a long and sustained crescendo. Whilst Wesley does allow the organ to accompany, if necessary, if the choir aren't up to it, for the first page or so, the organ really only pipes forth at the height of the crescendo, immediately then laying down a pedestrian lead to the verse of combined altos, tenors, and basses. This is clever, as it allows the organist to dictate the speed. Even in this period, it would be unusual, almost unheard of, for a separate person to wave their hands in front of the choir. That only became a regularized thing post-World War II. Again, the verse is a long crescendo, swapping to the trebles before the noted treble duet, Love One Another. Sickeningly sweet or sweetly sickening, depending on your viewpoint, it does demonstrate Wesley's skill for a good tune and crassly shows the harmonic weaknesses of the period. We then bat it back to ATB for throwing up into, we bat back to ATB for after throwing up into a metaphorical garbage can, only this time the men's verse is one of decay and withering. Literally, most altos and tenors would not be able to get a meaningful bottom F out, leaving only a hardened force of basses to conclude it. A crashing chord heralds the return of the chorus with "But the word of the Lord endureth forever." Some excellent fugal passages leading to a raucous crescendo to finish, but however, the organ wins the day. Wesley was outspoken in his need for urgent reform, but it is, as ever, the next generation who follow through with concrete plans. the Reverend John Jebb undertook a major analytical review of the state of choral services and standards, published in 1843. The picture was, as I've already stated, quite bleak. Wesley himself published pamphlets and lectured on the topic, urging cathedrals to professionalize musicians with decent stipends for singers and organists, that music purchasing, commissioning, and copying be regular with funds devoted to it, and that a college to train and nurture cathedral and church musicians should be formed. That baton was taken up by Frederick Gore Ouseley. Ouseley was fortunately a man of incredible financial means. A hereditary baronet, he became precentor of Hereford and professor of music at Oxford, thus carrying a great deal of weight in promoting his vision for a training facility for church musicians. This facility he founded at Tenbury in Worcestershire in 1856. The College of St. Michael was the first full choral foundation to be founded since the Reformation, and was to serve as a model laboratory for church music for well over a century. As well as being a practical place where daily choral services offered a wide range of repertoire, Ouseley's academic interests were keenly represented, him bequeathing a library of manuscripts he had collected, which still to this day is seen as one of the most valuable and extensive gathered by any individual in any era. The college thrived for a generation, but ultimately closed due to financial difficulties in 1985. Ouseley's library was transferred to the Bodleian in Oxford, where original scores of Purcell's Dido and Aeneas and Handel's own score of the Messiah that he conducted in Dublin can be viewed. The college trained a large number of reforming musicians and clergy. One of the ones who probably has left the greatest legacy to cathedral music is John Stainer. Stainer, of Crucifixion fame, can't be noticed as a top-tier composer. Some are willing to make that argument. I don't think it stands myself. But the discipline and understanding Stainer gained at Tenbury as a student was put into practice when he took on the position as organist of St. Paul's, working hard to change centuries of lackluster performance of music and worship, setting a path that has continued to this day as what we could claim to be the pinnacle of decently ordered worship and music. As I stated earlier, whilst Anglo-Catholic thought was centred on Oxford, the practical sides were explored in Cambridge and later in London. The move from thought to practicality came as a second generation trend, one that ended up dividing it into two schools of practice. The ritualistic controversy saw riots, imprisonment, and ultimately led to the long path of liturgical revision we still are living through today. Time unfortunately prohibits an in-depth narrative view. Maybe that's for another set of lectures. But what we see in this period is a fundamental pushing of boundaries of accepted liturgical norms. Whilst Pusey didn't adopt the eastward position to celebrate the Eucharist until 1871, and it's alleged Newman only ever read the communion service from the north end before his flight to Rome, it took the Cambridge Camden Society under Neil and Benjamin Webb to set alight the artistic flair in ceremonial architecture and music. You can see their architectural legacy at All Saints Margaret Street and to an extent at St. Alban the Martyr in Holborn. The society, later rebranded as the Ecclesiological Society, claimed to follow on from the Tractarian Tracts by espousing a return to pre-Reformation traditions in the celebration and conduct of liturgy. But some were tempted by the traditions of counter-Reformation Rome. And here we see that separation between those who followed what is cheekily called British Museum religion, as later espoused by Percy Dimmer and his followers, and those who believed that the natural evolution of liturgy and ritual would have followed counter-Reformation Rome. Early martyrs undertook innovations which many of us would not find scandalous at all. W.J.E. Bennett, who became Vicar of St. Paul's Knightsbridge in 1850, became notorious for the following: preaching in a surplice, the choir chanting psalms and hymns, intoning prayers, processions of choir and clergy, bowing to the communion table, and placing a cross on the communion table and lit candles during the reading of Holy Communion. An outcry of this so-called papal aggression, incited by a letter of Lord John Russell, led to violent riots outside the church during the whole of November 1850. Bennett resigned early in 1851, leaving his successor, Robert Liddell, to undertake the exploration of the legalities. What that case determined is crucial in explaining how much of what we take now for normal quickly spread through the Church of England. A plain cross without the corpus of Christ on was deemed legal for display, but not on the communion table itself. A stone altar was also found to be illegal, as communion table in law still had to be movable. The way a number of churches got around this was for the mensa, the top of the altar, to be in stone, whilst the support was to be of wood. For instance, at Durham Cathedral, whose original high altar, post-Reformation high altar, is made of stone marble, they got round this by encasing the original altar with a stone mensa and a wooden structure, the original sitting under the modern structure. This kerfuffle regarding the communion table was felt necessary to distinguish between the doctrine and ritual of the transubstantiationary sacrifice, which, in law at least, had still been rejected at the Reformation. A further martyr of the era, Charles Loder. He served as mission priest at St. George in the East London Docks. So we're not talking about refined suburban parishes here, but areas where degradation, disease, and poverty were all too apparent. So what were Loder's crimes? Use of vestments, the cross on the altar, surplice choir in the chancel, and the chanting of matins, evensong, and the litany. Whilst complaints were made, Archibald Tate, then Bishop of London, refused to take action because priests like Loder were working in areas that many of their detractors would refuse to take as livings. The first formal prosecution, however, under law, was of A.H. McConaughey, who was the Vicar of St. Alban the Martyr in Holborn. He was no ascete. He appreciated forms only as they were moving demonstrations of Catholic truth. He was one of the first English proponents of Ignatius Loyola's spiritual exercises. His devotion to hearing confession of the faithful saw that ministry grow at St. Albans. As one of the first priests of the Confraternity of the Blessed Sacrament, he aimed in his liturgical and spiritual conduct to pay what he believed the honour due to the person of our Lord in the Blessed Sacrament. Of course, this led him to be targeted by the Evangelical Church Association, and he was duly brought before the church courts in 1867 for elevating, then prostrating himself before the consecrated elements, for using lighted candles on the table during the communion as an ornament rather than for practical purposes, for the ceremonial use of incense during the service, and for mixing water with the wine in the communion cup. The legal judgment decided against elevation and the use of incense. However, the judge, Robert Fillmore, found that its incense use as an ancient, innocent, and pleasing custom. Fillmore ruled that the mixing of water and wine in the communion cup was legal, if not undertaken during the service, requiring the elements to be pre-prepared before the service. He did not, however, find that the use of candles for non-lighting purposes or prostration or kneeling were illegal. However, the Church Association lodged an appeal to the Privy Council, whose judicial committee ruled that both the last items were in fact illegal. So it's clear that with the judiciary being undetermined on some matters, and with clergy willing to ignore or test the law, more change was going to come. As was seen by the persecution of Bishop Edward King towards the end of the century, a movement was taking place in worship that required acceptance and codification. King, in his trial before the Archbishop of Canterbury in 1889, won a moral victory and gained a reasonable determination of what was acceptable in worship, namely the Eastward celebration, not only for the prayer of consecration, but for the entirety of the ante-communion, so eastward facing for the entire rite. A carefully defined permission of use for the mixed chalice containing wine and water, and the right to use 2 lighted candles, not only for lighting purposes during the service. A further concession was given to allow the restoration, although not yet in print, of the Agnus Dei after the prayer of consecration, restoring it almost to its position for the first time since the Reformation. However, it would not be until 1980 that it formally appeared in a commended book of liturgy, so nearly a century later. What we begin to see towards the end of the century is an awakening within English music. Whilst travel and study abroad had been limited in previous generations, we see towards the end of the 19th century an embrace of continental Europe. Study abroad, especially for musicians, was becoming a core part of their education. Whilst some older or old-fashioned musicians, like George Martin or Frederick Bridge, clung on to some of the less appealing aspects of Victoriana and its weaknesses, as expressed best by Maunder and Joseph Barmby, the new school of composers emerging, born mid-century, and attaining venerable status at the fin de siècle point, the way to widening the repertoire, both physically and compositionally. Whilst Hubert Parry and Charles Wood are rightly recognized as leading lights of this period, the contribution of Charles Stanford radicalized and rejuvenated composition in church music. For rather than trying to pigeonhole it merely as church music, Stanford worked hard to integrate compositional styles from wider music to reinvigorate the genre. Charles Stanford was born of an Anglo-Irish family in Dublin, studying privately under Robert Stewart before going up to Cambridge in 1870. While still an undergraduate, he held the position as organist of Trinity College during 1873. After graduation, he studied in Germany with Reinecke in Leipzig and Kiel in Berlin. For the majority of his professional career, he was professor of composition at the Royal College of Music, laying the foundations for Charles Wood, Rayford Williams, Herbert Howells, and many, many others. Stanford's contribution to wider composition is exhaustive. Over 200 works that include 7 symphonies, 11 concertos, 9 operas, over 20 collections of songs, and 40 choral works. His contribution to church music is vast, unparalleled since the era of John Blow. He understood the true function of music in worship. With a natural gift for melody, coupled with first-class technical skill, he was a big enough personality to cut right across the fashions and passing styles of the era. He's recognized as the first composer to make an active effort to structure his services and anthems, reusing themes and ideas like any symphonic composer of that age would naturally do. In doing so, he corrected one of the core weaknesses in church music composition, trying to link several sections together without overlapping themes or an attempt at structural cohesion. So when we were looking at the verse anthems a couple of weeks back, you'll see that a lot of them are very bitty, and this idea carries through even through to Wesley, where things were worked in sections and there was no interlink. You just end up having a chord and moving on, or they would just kind of erupt as a trio. Stanford did away with that, and we'll see in a minute how he did that. By deploying the German leitmotif idea throughout the course of his compositions, Stanford gained compositional and harmonic cohesion that has managed to stand the litmus test of his time, His services and anthems have really not ever gone out of performance fashion. Some are weaker than others, some have kind of waned and waxed, but if you look at the core, which we'll look at the big one, Stamford in B flat in a second, but if you look at his services in C and A and the evening service in G, they've basically stayed in the rep all through since being published. An amazing achievement. So we're going to have a quick look at this case study, Stamford in B flat, which many of us will know. But of course, this was Stamford's first set of canticles. And he wrote it as a complete setting. So it was the morning set, Te Deum, Benedictus and Jubilate. For Holy Communion, responses to the commandments, the creeds, the Sanctus and Gloria, and then a Magnificat and Nunc Dimittis for evensong. Highly singable, highly accessible, the work became a staple of choirs at various levels of parish and cathedral. What we see in this first set is Stamford experimenting in applying instrumental forms to church music. Here, it's not always convincing, as Stamford's application of them is too rigid, which brings a sort of predictability in its return. So for example, the Te Deum begins with 3 statements of the main theme and fits the text well. But when, as you can see below, the passage returns to the end with day by day, the words are repeated, the harmonies repeated, but spaced out to fit the original tune. Stamford uses this as his leitmotif throughout the Te Deum, deploying it in the accompaniment in the pedals that heaven and earth are full of thy glory, and vouchsafe, O Lord, which you can see up there. Stamford's base for this motif is the ancient plainchant for Te Deum Laudamus. In the creed of the communion service, he introduces the chant for that, again developing it thematically. While Stamford, like most composers, mutates and develops the intonations to conform to his own harmonic and rhythmic pattern, it's quite a feat that this is the first notable use of plainchant motif in English church music for around 200 years. Others were then quick to follow Stamford's example. But unlike many of his predecessors, even where there are weaknesses, Stamford's harmonic language is firm and clean, with effective modulations and a strong and vigorous bass line. From the service in B flat, Stamford takes the model and improves it. His service in A, particularly the evening canticles, demonstrate the pinnacle of symphonic writing and his German teaching. His setting in C is relatable, yet stunningly effective. And his service in G demonstrates writing for soloists with quiet taking about seat and an independent, driven organ accompaniment. I'm sure most of you do know them, but it's worth digging around the movements you may not know in the full services, especially the creeds, because those are really, really rich. The late Dr. Francis Jackson believed that the creeds of English communion service settings was often where you'd find the creative juices of a composer. And Francis commented many times and has put in print his view that actually the axing of the prayer book communion service and a sung creed musically has made any kind of English setting almost, from a musical sense, null and void. So whilst we've got this musical extravaganza going on, it is hardly possible to exaggerate the liturgical chaos that we were seeing in the early 20th century Church of England. We see British Museum moderate Anglo-Catholicism of Percy Dearmer of the English use. We see the Baroque Roman Counter-Reformation of Anglo-Papists of the Society of St. Peter and St. Paul, transporting the beholder into a 17th or 18th century church in Spain or France, or the evangelical bareness of a simple oak communion table, lengthy sermons, and unmistakable reformed nature. Dearmer catalogued his findings in his Parson's Handbook, having used his parish, St. Mary's, Primrose Hill, as an experimental laboratory. The book went to, I think it was 12 imprints during his lifetime, and then a 13th after his death, which actually is worth, the 13th is actually worth a look, because it does tidy up some of Uncle Percy's, I won't define it, cock-ups. Percy was a great antiquarian, but he put 2 and 2 together and made 5. And fortunately, the editors of the 13th edition did manage to do a bit of unpicking of that, which is a great blessing to everyone. But what we see in Percy's ideas, both, as I said, historically based and cobbled together, is an idea to reflect what pre-Reformation English worship could have looked like. Vestments followed designs of the 15th century, with the addition of apparels at the neck, wrist, and ankle on the albs. And you can see Dr. Dearmer there with his apparels and his quite raffish amice on show. He took the ceremonial was elaborate, but mostly faithful to the rites celebrated in the 15th century. Very English, very clipped. If you've never seen a kind of Dearmer celebration, it's not got the exuberance that you'd see in more exotic Anglo-Catholic shrines. It's more reserved. Yeah, it's the best way I can describe it. Dearmer took music very seriously. Gone was the weak, sentimental Victoriana, but in its place, working with composers such as Ralph Vaughan Williams, encouraging a pastoral folk-based hymnody as espoused in the joint editorship of the English hymnal. His work was forwarded by the Alcuin Club and brought to physicality by the Wareham Guild. Whilst the Alcuin Club laid the intellectual and practical thought, the Wareham Guild brought it to life in the creation of vestments, woodwork, and silverware. The Guild, the Parson's Handbook, and the Alcuin Club publications forwarded a legal, strongly nationalistic, and thoroughly British antiquarian celebration of liturgy. I'm sorry, that should be English, not British, because they're looking back to pre-Edward VI. The more extreme Anglo-Papalist tendencies of the Society of St. Peter and Paul looked towards corporate reunion with Rome, influenced by its leading lights, the brothers Ronald and Wilfred Knox, N.P. Williams, Cyril Howell, and the Duke of Argyll. We see for the first time the advent of Eurotat, the mass purchasing of vestments, monstrances, tabernacles, crucifixes, and silverware from Spain, France, and Italy. Whilst Dearmer was looking back to Edward VI and what he found in the British Museum, the Society adherents looked to the Counter-Reformation and outposts of Spanish and Italian ultramontanism. The introduction of benediction and the rosary returned devotional piety to the Church of England, with theatrical liturgical performance following the ceremonial of the Roman Rite of Adrian Fortescue. The architect for the movement was Martin Travers, whose drawings and designs are a lasting legacy. His work can be best experienced at St. Magnus the Martyr, London Bridge, and seen in the Holy House at Walsingham. The Holy House took great inspiration from its namesake, Santa Casa Loreto, with 15 altars dedicated to an individual mystery of the Rosary. Blazed with a plethora of votive candle stands and the lingering smell of incense, you can half wonder whether the Reformation ever took place there. Whilst Dearmer's adherents were careful how they enriched worship, and were very careful to look at the law and the precedent in English terms, Anglo-Papists made no qualms of interpolating the Roman Rite into the BCP. These interpolations ensured a weakening of the 200 and so year old prayer book as the visible symbol of unity and conformity. It was clear that innovation was needed, and circumstance and chance had finally collided to ensure necessary revision. The report of the Royal Commission on Ecclesiastical Discipline of 1906 noted 10 illegal practices inconsistent with the teaching of the Church of England as declared in the prayer book. Some, but by no means all of these, included the interpolation of prayers and ceremonies belonging to the canon of the Mass, the adoration of the reserved sacrament, processions with the Blessed Sacrament, as we see at Corpus Christi, benediction with the sacrament, and the observation of Roman festivals of the Assumption of Mary and of the Sacred Heart. The 3 volumes of report demonstrated that conformity as envisaged in 1662 had been inviolably broken for some time, and it can't be wholly blamed on Anglo-Catholics, Anglo-Papists. The nonconformists and evangelicals also were pushing boundaries too. But neither law or governance within the church was able to lead the change. The First World War demonstrated the fallacy that the 1662 alone could serve all necessities. Chaplains in the field, many of whom went on to leading positions within church hierarchy, needed to reserve the sacrament to bring to the sick and dying. The language of the offices neither aroused prayerfulness or devotion from men in khaki. Neither did it reach the depths of the experiences that these men were daily experiencing. Working with American and Scottish clergy saw renewing interest by English clergy in liturgical revision. Combined with the limited attempt at self-government Parliament now granted to the Church through the establishment of the National Assembly, it was felt the prayer book revision was now long overdue. Grieves me slightly that we're going to have to rush this, as the conflicts of that era teach us a great deal about those in the present and of our recent past. But c'est la vie. The archbishops set up 5 committees of inquiry after the First World War to inform them of necessary changes needed not only in worship, but in the whole life of the church. The report, The Worship of the Church, noted the spread of materialistic ideas, the overpressure of industrial life, the weakening of home life in general, and a deepened reticence about all religious matters. Sounds familiar. Aggressive individualism and class warfare militated against the idea of one unified body of Christ, central to worship and fellowship, alienating the poor from the church. As the report noted, the idea of the church as an institution governed by and administered by comparatively small circles of the well-to-do classes steadily took root in the mind of the people. We also note in the report the sea change that was led by both Anglo-Catholic parties of the centrality of the Eucharist as the pinnacle of Sunday worship. Whilst this was starting to take root with groups such as Parish and People, building on the wave of revival in the inter and post-war periods, it was noted in the report that the Eucharist satisfies more directly the spiritual impulses than morning and evening prayer. Much was published, both official and unofficial, exploring potentials for improving the liturgy. Evangelicals, centrists, Dearmists, Anglo-Papists all put forward proposals. Some worked together whilst some worked apart. These were worked through and debated in the democratic heart of the church. One important note here is that at no point was this book intended to replace, but only to supplement the 1662 book. So all the rights of the 1662 book were not being changed. Anything that was being added was in addition. Having managed to agree compromise, the Houses of the National Assembly presented it to Parliament, the ultimate arbiter. It's at this point that all hell broke loose, with a vocal minority having established a voracious lobbying campaign. Further compromises attempted to be brokered as the new potential prayer book journeyed through the Commons and Lords, but ultimately the politicians in a mixture of sheer bloody-mindedness and voracious lobbying, voted down the book. The comment of George Bell, then Dean of Canterbury and later Bishop of Chichester, sums up the whole debacle. In a single and hectic night, the House of Commons had apparently destroyed the work of more than 20 years. The deposited book, without legal standing, would have to be used illegally under law, but commended sotto voce by the bishops and church government. A mess. It would take another war, a fundamental change in society, and independence of church governance to try and make substantive change again. Next week in our final session, we'll look at that change, the continued development of church music in the recent past, and let's see if we can discuss what the future might hold. Thank you.
Terrific, Ben. Thank you very much. I've got, well, perhaps while there's a thinking of questions, I'm going to leap in and just mention, as I'm writing orders of service for carol services, what can you tell us about Eric Milner White? Where does he sit in all of this? The person who wrote he wasn't the originator of the 9 lessons and carols, was he? But he sort of came to define it through his.
No, I don't think we certainly can't claim him to be the originator, but Milner White had an amazing skill at refining and developing from others and bringing it forward. Milner White had been was chaplain at King's. He at King's Cambridge just after the war. He'd been a chaplain in the Great War and served on the front in France. And when I was talking about chaplain, it was actually Milner White I was kind of referring to, because he was one of the leading voices kicking off, saying this will not do, and was talking to not only Scottish Episcopalian and American Episcopalians and Canadian Anglicans, but also speaking to brethren in the Church of Scotland and other Reformed churches to talk about how you could use text, what was appropriate. And of course, really, by 1928, a lot of work had been done on the reservation of the sacrament, and that being available and being perpetually reserved in churches. That is a direct consequence of the First World War, of the need for that to become regularized, that people were wanting the sacrament, especially in extremist situations. And it was clear with the visitation of the sick office in 1662 that it wasn't meeting the need. But Milner White then went from King's to become Dean of York. And of course, there inherited and encouraged. I call it's like a taking on of the Diemer ideas, but very much shaping them. And he contributed a huge amount to what I would call the Rite of York. And I'm trying, when obviously the present presenter of York is a very, very busy person, but she and I are trying to get heads together to talk about this and develop it, because there is a rich corpus of writings, of his thoughts on the liturgies he produced at York. He did at quite a number of times combine the deanery and the precentorship, which was the model which a later predecessor did, which was slightly more controversial.
Was that Dean Jasper?
That was Ron Jasper, and
whose son is in fact staying with me this evening. So Professor David Jasper. So I shall mention that. Anyway, I won't go on. Charlotte, you got a question?
Yeah, I've read that the church was really unprepared for war, and that there are a few chaplains serving on the front, and people were saying, where was God, obviously, and so people were very hostile to the church. Could you just explore that a little bit?
I'm sadly I'm not
Woodbine Willie and
expert.
things.
Sorry, Charlotte, I cut you off there.
I think there was a chaplain called Woodbine Willie, who was at the front, but very few chaplains did serve at the front. They were absent.
Well, I'm not the expert on that. The real expert on that is a colleague and a former colleague and my soon-to-be supervisor, Michael Snape, who's the Ramsey Professor at Durham. Mike is the leading historian in that. So anything written by him, and he's looked at the First World War for obvious reasons recently, is worth a look.
Okay.
But part of the issue. But yeah, absolutely, you're right. There was this concern that clergy were ineffective, the officers were ineffective, and those who were out there felt that they'd not really had the training, the nous, or were equipped with. I don't think anyone could be equipped to deal with that. I was really lucky in my 4 years at Durham. I worked with the Royal Army chaplaincy department. They'd come and visit us each year for in-service training, and they would, the military chaplains and reserve chaplains would come and they'd spend a couple of days with us. And that's something we take, that the Church of England now takes very seriously, in working in combination with academia, both at Sandhurst and in the universities, and in training. But at that time, I don't think there was much that could be done to prepare them. I think read the poems of Wilfred Owen. I don't think anyone could be prepared for that. And I think everyone was probably going, where was God in it?
I might just leap in, having read a bit more Mike Snape, Charlotte. That I think that the view that you described was very much the established view for a long time because of Alan Wilkinson's book on the Church of England and the First World War. And Mike Snape's done a lot of work actually to talk about the kind of lively faith that you found in the trenches, much more so than those than was commonly accepted. I think partly because a lot of the memoirs which have shaped the cultural imagination about the First World War are actually written at the end of the 1920s by men who've abandoned their faith actually sometime really in the 1920s rather than in the First World War, but like Sassoon or Vera Britton's Testament to Youth. So I think there's the current feeling amongst historians is that slightly over-egged that view that it was just an utterly godless experience. Of course, it presented all sorts of challenges to the faith of the late 19th century, which was all about the progress of mankind and the brotherhood of man and all the rest of it. But it can be overplayed a bit.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else wanting to ask anything? Now's your chance. There's me hoping someone will ask about vestments so I can talk about it.
You need to do a whole separate course on vestments.
I could.
Ben.
But quick. We've only got a minute or so, but I'm kind of just defaulting back, Daniel, to your comment about Milner White and York. You saw it in your own cathedral at Chichester with Duncan Jones, whose customary is, superb. Lots of, out of this period, there was a willingness to experiment, and Percy Dearmer, Milner White, Duncan Jones, to an extent, it is very English, and it's caught up with this kind of revival of folk. Of folk kind of traditions, whether that be in music as seen by Holst and Vaughan Williams, and you can see an English hymnal, or in folk traditions. And actually, I think it's in Duncan Jones. There's in the Chichester customary, there are tableaus which involve processional recorders, which I think
still happens.
That still happens.
Well, I did before the pandemic. Epiphany Carol service. It was
fabulous.
Instructions about recorder processions. Yeah,
marvelous. But it comes back to that, and this kind of you're looking at Conrad Knoll and who was it at St Martin in the Fields, Dick yes, this kind of soft socialism, and as we said, kind of the next evolution of the Brotherhood of Man, all these people who had in some way or other been affected by this terrible, horrific conflict. And so you see this nationalism, and it's soft nationalism. It's not, they're not singing Land of Hope and Glory without a raise of irony, and especially someone like Vaughan Williams. But then you have, extreme the Anglo-Papists who, pray daily for the Holy Father. We should always pray for the Holy Father and any religious leader, of course, but they pray for the Holy Father before they pray for their diocesan, and you would find that they were eagerly waiting for the day that, their stipend did not come from the diocesan, from bishop, but from, the Holy See. And, you get this going on, and, it is quite an interesting time. Hasn't been much study kind of the overlap, because it was quite camped, and then of course you get the evangelicals, and then, as we head towards the Second World War, which we'll talk about next week, you get then the whole American evangelical kind of tradition taking root, which kind of pulled the rug from our own evangelical tradition and softened it. So you end up with this at one point, 4 major groups kind of working within the church. But I may talk about that next week. I haven't finished my lecture yet, so I'm going to have to work that in.
We look forward to it, Ben. But thank you so much. I think, especially as we sort of draw nearer to our own time, it's amazing how you begin to see the various strands which shape our own worship nowadays. So it's really great, and not least as we all sit through Stanford and B flat week after week. But thank you so much, and come back next week for your final session, which we really look forward to.
Great. See you then.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.